You're listening to Kingdom Thinking, a podcast series designed to start a conversation around the deeper intellectual questions surrounding life, faith, and meaning. Here are a collection of questions, ideas, and stories that I hope will challenge you to think about your own beliefs, and perhaps introduce you to new perspectives, regardless of where you are in your journey. I'm your host, Al Butcher, and I can't wait to share this episode with you. This episode of Kingdom Thinking is dedicated towards examining the question, is the Bible reliable? And what do we even mean by this? Are there multiple ways in which a document can be reliable? So, as you may have noticed here at Kingdom Thinking, I very frequently like to read out from the Bible. And the primary reason why I do like to do that is to show you that essentially these ideas that I'm communicating are not really my own. You know, this podcast is called Kingdom Thinking, not Alistair Thinking. And the purpose of me quoting scripture is that I hope to communicate what I believe to be the orthodox Christian position on issues, not just some idea that I've come up with. But then I think that begs the question of this document that I'm quoting from, and, you know, this document that pastors in churches and Christians in the public sphere seem to be quoting from on a rather regular basis. What is the Bible, and is it reliable? I think this is a very important question to ask, particularly for those of us who aren't Christians, because I think we need to make up our minds about what we feel about the Bible and what place we feel that it occupies within historical literature. But first of all, let's examine the question. When we ask, is the Bible reliable, what do we actually mean by this? You see, the Bible could be reliable or unreliable in more than one sense, and I think when we fail to understand the different spheres in which the Bible operates, we often discount this text or discount this document and often fail to understand it correctly. You see, the Bible can really be reliable or unreliable in two primary senses. The Bible is an historical document because it makes claims about events in human history, particularly throughout the course of the Old Testament and the events surrounding Jesus' life. The Bible makes very clear claims about events in history, and more than that, the Bible actually hinges many of its spiritual truths, spiritual lessons, on the occurrence of historical events. So the first question that's really important to ask is the Bible historically reliable? However, the second question, and one that I think is generally more applicable when we're talking about this question, is asking ourselves whether the Bible is morally or ethically reliable. What do we mean by morally or ethically reliable? You see, the Bible is very unique in that it is both a moral and an historical text, as I mentioned before, often at the same time. And this issue is particularly present when we examine Old Testament literature because there's sometimes a confusion between an event being reported as it happened and a spiritual or moral lesson being taught through a person's actions. And disentangling the two can sometimes be confusing. However, this week I want to particularly examine the moral side of the reliability, or whether or not the Bible is authoritative morally, and then hopefully in the next episode I'd really like to look at the historical validity or the historical reliability of the Bible. So in order to discuss the morality of the Bible, there are a few main areas that I want to walk through and that I want to talk about as I discuss the moral reliability of the Bible. The first is the fact that much of modern Western ethical thought and ethical effort is actually grounded in Judeo-Christian values. Certainly there have been philosophical contributions from across the spectrum, from atheist philosophers as well as Christian, as well as Muslim, as well as philosophers who've held varying degrees of faith. But that's not just the kind of ethical thought that I'm talking about. I'm not just talking about lofty philosophers. What I'm talking about is the primary movements addressing moral crises in Western societies have, at their core, been founded on Christian values. Let me give you a couple of examples. The first example that I'd like to talk about is the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire. You see, the slave trade in the British Empire was a massively profitable part of the empire. In fact, it's where they got most of their money. It's where most of British economic power came from, both the sale of and then the use of slaves within the colonies. However, the group of men leading the abolition, the abolitionists, were none other than a group of high-profile Christian parliamentarians, and the leader of their movement was a man named William Wilberforce, who was a parliamentarian, he was a parishioner, and he was a very passionate Christian during a time where there was a great deal of turmoil and questions arising within the Christian church. Let me just give you one quote from William Wilberforce. He says, "Surely the principles of Christianity lead to action as well as meditation." See, for William Wilberforce, he regarded that the abolition of the slave trade was not just something that was incidental to his faith, or that it was something that he was kind of doing in his own time. Rather, he viewed the abolition of the slave trade as directly linked to his Christian faith, as a direct part of the morality that his God had commanded him to live by. Another example is the civil rights movement in the United States, led by the widely popularized figure Martin Luther King Jr., who in himself, his full title was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was actually a pastor of a Baptist church in the area. In many of his speeches, he had a tendency to quote Bible verses, sometimes referencing them, sometimes not referencing them. When he was walking and delivering a speech in Montgomery, he quoted Amos chapter 5, verse 24, which says, "Let justice flow like a river and righteousness like a mighty stream." Again, for Martin Luther King Jr., the advancement of the civil rights and his work with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was not simply something that was incidental to his faith, but rather it was something that was actually grounded in his faith, and he even believed was inherently tied up in the morality of his faith. This really lends credibility to the idea that the Bible should be considered to be morally authoritative or morally reliable. Both of these men, great Christian leaders, were not alive at the time of Jesus, and as a consequence only got their ideas about Christian morality from the Bible. Yet this Christian morality laid out in the Bible, in fact even quoted and used by Martin Luther King Jr. in his speeches, was regarded for them as the primary impetus behind their civil action. As a consequence, it's clear that this document, the Bible, clearly resonates with the human natural moral law that we seem to all have inside of us that I talked about in the first episode. In fact, many of the values themselves which underpin our society are Judeo-Christian, and they resonate deeply with us. One would only need to look at, for example, beginning in Matthew chapter 5, running through chapter 7, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, to find teachings such as going the extra mile with somebody, or loving your neighbor, or turning the other cheek, or refraining from judging somebody else, or taking the stick out of your own eye before you judge the speck in somebody else's. These have all become practically cultural tropes within our society, but all originated within Judeo-Christian thought. In fact, even going back further, in the book of Exodus, where it details the receipt of Christian law, well, not Christian law, but Jewish law by the figure Moses, we have the 10 Commandments and we have the initial laws that were handed down to Moses, and many of them look strikingly similar to modern considerations and modern moral issues that we're facing today. In fact, reading through the Sermon on the Mount and reading through those initial commandments in Exodus, many of the concerns and many of the moral issues are actually the same moral issues that we seem to be wrestling with and we seem to be facing today. Thus, the Bible, as a document that has shaped much of modern Western ethical thought, continues to be relevant as it talks about moral quandaries that we continue to face today, such as dealing with someone who offends you, such as how to conduct yourself well in business dealings, such as laws on theft, laws on murder, and more importantly, above all else, the command to love your neighbor as you love yourself. In fact, within the Bible, Jesus describes this commandment along with the command to love God as containing the entire law and the prophets. As a consequence, because this document resonates morally with us and in fact deals with many of the same issues, it doesn't really make sense to say that the Bible is not morally authoritative or morally reliable. However, one thing that I think needs to be addressed is that the majority of the people making this claim that the Bible is not morally reliable, that the Bible is not morally authoritative, that it paints a picture of a God who is angry, cruel, vindictive, and malicious, popular atheists like Richard Dawkins have popularized this view, aren't actually talking about the morals and the ethics expressed in the Sermon on the Mount. They're not talking about the morals and the ethics expressed within the Ten Commandments. No, what they're actually railing against are specific applications of those themes and of those commandments particularly within the Old Testament. You know, it doesn't take long for you to be on Facebook or anywhere on the internet before finding some kind of image which brings up a quote from the Bible and says, oh, look, this quote from the Bible says that if you dishonor your mother and father, that you should be put to death. Or if you sleep with someone who isn't your spouse, that you should be forced to marry them, even if it was unwilling. And these passages are pointed to as showing the immorality or the moral bankruptcy of the Bible. Just to address that point, I think it's really important to note that these qualms that people have with biblical morality, they're not qualms or difficulties with the overarching themes of biblical morality, with the overarching, what I believe and what many would see to be the overarching Christian message being one of loving one's neighbor and doing good to others and doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. But rather, these qualms are a railing against a perceived hypocrisy of God or of an improper application of what they believe to be a good principle. So I'd just like to talk to that for a couple of minutes. See, in fact, there are very few people who can argue with Christian moral principles, but let's address these concerns that many have around Old Testament law and what seems to be a vindictive, angry God. The first point that I think is really important to raise is that Old Testament law was revolutionarily moral. Now, that might seem like quite a strange claim to make, but in fact, within the ancient world, particularly for the Israelite people as they're being delivered out of the culture of Egypt and as they're moving into the culture of Canaan, these people are surrounded by savage cultures on all sides. You know, we have historical documents that show that the people of Canaan even practiced child sacrifice and cannibalism. So within the modern context, when we look back at the ancient world, we should actually be around the board surprised by how barbaric the majority of these ancient societies were. And in fact, within the Old Testament, it established many principles, even within laws that seem harsh today, that actually underpin the functioning of our legal system. For example, within the Old Testament, there is the quote where it says, you shall render eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. And we have the popularized quote, an idea of an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. But that's actually a fundamental misunderstanding of the purpose of that law. See, the idea of an eye for an eye in the Old Testament was not that you should lash out against people who hurt you, but rather that the punishment should be proportional to the crime. The idea expressed in the Old Testament was not that we should go around ripping out people's eyes who irritate us, but rather that the punishment for an eye cannot exceed the size of the crime, which is a remarkably humane idea in an ancient society where essentially the rich and powerful got to do whatever they wanted. So it's clear that the Old Testament law was actually revolutionarily moral in many cases and actually was designed to bring strong societal organization in a period where the Israelite people were interacting with many extremely barbaric cultures and peoples. However, the second point that I think I need to raise about this is that while Old Testament law seems harsh, it actually reflects how seriously God takes sin. You see, we live in a culture that panders to what feels right. We live in a culture that tells us that whatever we want to do, whoever we want to be, that's all right. That so long as we're true to who we are inside, that's okay. And as a consequence, these moral laws within the Old Testament, which even seem to be prescribing death for things that we would seem to be, quite trivial and, oh, that's not so bad. Oh, who hasn't done that? Oh, who hasn't made that decision? These laws seem extremely barbaric to us, not because those laws themselves are barbaric, but because we live in a society and a culture that has downplayed the existence and importance of sin. As a consequence, the Bible is not necessarily a document that's out of touch or out of time, but rather that our culture has become very accepting of sins and moral degradations that are ultimately going to lead to significantly negative life outcomes for many of us, either in this life or in the next. Essentially, biblical morality in this sense has to be understood and criticized as a whole worldview, not simply by picking out particular verses and then saying, oh, because of this verse, the entire Christian moral ethos is absolutely bankrupt. No, they have to be understood, first of all, within this context of the underlying principles, second of all, within the cultural context in which the people of Israel lived, and then finally, within the context of understanding how seriously God takes our sin. Christianity provides a compelling, a self-consistent, and an attested answer to life's most significant questions. The Christian faith has stood the test of time. The Bible has stood the test of time. And in fact, while many may not agree with it, Christianity actually does provide a self-consistent moral system. Those who would seek to criticize Christianity for being barbaric or for being backward, as I discussed in the first episode, may find themselves with no moral leg to go back upon. And as a consequence, Christianity, by the consideration of others as made in the image of God, by establishing a remarkable moral law, and by establishing incredible principles for societal interaction, is actually a remarkably morally forward document, not morally backward. And it's for this reason that we can trust the Bible's moral advice on many of our life issues. Thank you for listening to this episode of Kingdom Thinking. I release new episodes every week, so jump on the Kingdom Thinking Facebook page for notifications about episodes as they come out, as well as information about the episodes like transcripts. Until next time, have a great week and God bless.